Hello， 大家好，我是立恩。今天我们又要开始来上正义课的第4课了。由哈佛大学最著名的哲学系教授桑德尔老师呢，来带我们上最后一堂关于功利主义的道德哲学。如果你是从第1课一直跟到今天这一课的话，好不好？请给自己先一个掌声，好吗？因为要讨论道德的哲学问题其实课程是越上到后面某种程度上是越深奥。好，这个需要你愿意持之以恒，不断的去思考以及探索这个问题。通常能够上到这边的朋友呢，我必须要说，你真的很棒，你很认真在追求探索人类自身的一个本质性的问题。就像我以前讲的，一切的法律的基础，它都离不开道德学。所有人世间的一个事物的对错判断标准，如果没有认真深刻的去思考，去厘清道德的尺度以及道德的衡量依据到底在哪里的话，坦白说，人就很难去理解自身到底跟动物有什么不同。
一等生物。
所以，但是呢，如果你听这个课觉得很无聊的朋友呢，那也没关系，好不好？有的时候呢，可能是我带的切入点角度还不够吸引你，是我这个主持人引荐的功夫还不够好，那请多包涵。那我们之前前3堂除了第1堂我们有针对道的2种主义呢，也就是功利主义跟所谓的绝对道德主义呢，有做过稍微的比较跟分析。那桑德老师在2、3堂呢，就都带我们探讨的是这个功利主义创始人，也就是 Jeremy Bentham 大师。那我们今天第4堂就是要特别来看这个 Jeremy Bentham 之后呢，在这个功利主义可以说进化到 2.0 版的一个出名的大师，那就是 John Stuart Mill 那这一堂课因为相对会比较有一点复杂，所以我中间呢会打断做一些补充说明。OK， 让我们就一起来看吧 ，Let's go。
Last time we began to consider some objections to Jeremy Bentham's version of utilitarianism. People raised 2 objections in the discussion we had. The first was the objection, the claim, that utilitarianism, by concerning itself with the greatest good for the greatest number, fails adequately to respect individual rights. Today we have debates about torture and terrorism. Suppose a suspected terrorist was apprehended on September 10th, and you had reason to believe that the suspect had crucial information about an impending terrorist attack that would kill over 3,000 people, and you couldn't extract the information. Would it be just to torture the suspect to get the information? Or do you say, no, there is a categorical moral duty of respect for individual rights? In a way, we're back to the questions we started with about trolley cars and organ transplants. So that's the first issue. And you remember we considered some examples of cost-benefit analysis. But a lot of people were unhappy with cost-benefit analysis when it came to placing a dollar value on human life. And so that led us to the second objection. It questioned whether it's possible to translate all values into a single uniform measure of value. It asks, in other words, whether all values are commensurable. Let me give you one other example of an experience. This actually is a true story. It comes from personal experience that raises a question, at least, about whether all values can be translated without loss into utilitarian terms. Some years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was at Oxford in England, and they had men's and women's colleges. They weren't yet mixed. And the women's colleges had rules against overnight male guests. By the 1970s, these rules were rarely enforced and easily violated, or so I was told. By the late 1970s, when I was there, pressure grew to relax these rules, and it became the subject of debate among the faculty at St. Anne's College, which was one of these all-women's colleges. The older women on the faculty were traditionalists. They were opposed to change on conventional moral grounds. But times had changed, and they were embarrassed to give the true grounds for their objection. And so they translated their arguments into utilitarian terms. If men stay overnight, they argued, the costs to the college will increase. How, you might wonder? Well, they'll want to take baths, and that'll use up hot water, they said. Furthermore, they argued, we'll have to replace the mattresses more often. The reformers met these arguments by adopting the following compromise. Each woman could have a maximum of 3 overnight male guests each week. They didn't say whether it had to be the same one or 3 different. Provided, and this was the compromise, provided the guest paid 50 pence to defray the cost to the college. The next day, the national headline in the national newspaper read, St. Anne's girls 50 pence a night. Another illustration of the difficulty of translating all values, in this case a certain idea of virtue, into utilitarian terms. So that's all to illustrate the second objection to utilitarianism, at least the part of that objection that questions whether utilitarianism is right to assume that we can assume the uniformity of value, the commensurability of all values, and translate all moral considerations into dollars or money. But there is a second aspect to this worry about aggregating values and preferences. Why should we weigh all preferences that people have without assessing whether they're good preferences or bad preferences? Shouldn't we distinguish between higher pleasures and lower pleasures?
功利主义呢，它其实有很显而易见的2个问题。第一个就是我们知道，功利主义它会忽视掉个体的权利啊。也就是像我们之前谈到的这个船难吃人事件啊，等等等等，哈，就是说为了多数人整体的利益或者说幸福，哈，是不是就可以牺牲少数人，或者说牺牲个人？那这个就一直是功利主义的被人诟病的地方。那第二个最大的被诟病的地方就是说，功利主义它试图想要用一种标准来衡量所谓的总体幸福值，因为你如果要说什么是合乎大多数人的利益，对吧？那你总要有一个衡量的标准。所以呢，我们在第3堂课呢也上到过这个，就是人的生命权利可以用金钱来衡量嘛，因为似乎金钱至少是一个量化的指标。那所以功利主义就提倡说，也许是不是我们可以用金钱来衡量一切事物的标准，也就是说每个人他可以接受的程度都是可以用价格来衡量，
钱要多少有多少。
但是这似乎呢也被人诟病，因为这出现一个问题，就是说每个人看重的侧重点是不同的，那你其实没有办法对每样事情都做所谓的量化指标。
花有重开日，人无再少年。
而且呢，你量化完呢，彼此之间的比较啊，会牺牲掉的是某些人认为最重要的事情。
Now, part of the appeal of not making any qualitative distinctions about the worth of people's preferences, part of the appeal is that it is non-judgmental and egalitarian. The Benthamite utilitarian says, everybody's preferences count, and they count regardless of what people want, regardless of what makes different people happy. For Bentham, all that matters, you'll remember, are the intensity and the duration of a pleasure or pain. The so-called higher pleasures or nobler virtues are simply those, according to Bentham, that produce stronger, longer pleasure. He had a famous phrase to express this idea: the quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. What was pushpin? It was some kind of a child's game, like tiddlywinks. Pushpin is as good as poetry, Bentham says. And lying behind this idea, I think, is the claim, the intuition, that it's a presumption to judge whose pleasures are intrinsically higher or worthier or better. And there is something attractive in this refusal to judge. After all, some people like Mozart, others Madonna. Some people like ballet, others bowling. Who's to say, a Benthamite might argue, who's to say which of these pleasures, whose pleasures, are higher, worthier, nobler than others? But is that right? This refusal to make qualitative distinctions. Can we altogether dispense with the idea that certain things we take pleasure in are better or worthier than others? Think back to the case of the Romans in the Colosseum. One thing that troubled people about that practice is that it seemed to violate the rights of the Christian. Another way of objecting to what's going on there is that the pleasure that the Romans take in this bloody spectacle, should that pleasure, which is a base, kind of corrupt, degrading pleasure, should that even be valorized or weighed in deciding what the general welfare is? So here are the objections to Bentham's utilitarianism. And now we turn to someone who tried to respond to those objections, a later-day utilitarian, John Stuart Mill. So what we need to examine now is whether John Stuart Mill had a convincing reply to these objections to utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill was born in 1806. His father, James Mill, was a disciple of Bentham's. And James Mill set about giving his son, John Stuart Mill, a model education. He was a child prodigy, John Stuart Mill. He knew Greek at the age of 3, Latin at 8, and age 10, he wrote a history of Roman law. At age 20, he had a nervous breakdown. This left him in a depression for 5 years. But at age 25, what helped lift him out of this depression is that he met Harriet Taylor. She and Mill got married. They lived happily ever after. And it was under her influence that John Stuart Mill tried to humanize utilitarianism. What Mill tried to do was to see whether the utilitarian calculus could be enlarged and modified to accommodate humanitarian concerns like the concern to respect individual rights, and also to address the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. In 1859, Mill wrote a famous book on liberty, the main point of which was the importance of defending individual rights and minority rights. And in 1861, toward the end of his life, he wrote the book we read as part of this course, Utilitarianism. He makes it clear that utility is the only standard of morality, in his view. So he's not challenging Bentham's premise. He's affirming it. He says very explicitly, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually do desire it. So he stays with the idea that our de facto, actual, empirical desires are the only basis for moral judgment. But then, page 8 also in chapter 2, he argues that it is possible for a utilitarian to distinguish higher from lower pleasures.
好，这里开始呢，我们就要进入到功利主义道德论的这个改良者，Stuart Mill。那他呢就认为说，其实功利主义本身并没有错，但是呢，功利主义呢确实还可以更好的去把更关乎大多数人真正追求的偏好来看待什么事情才是人们极大化的道德追求所应该追求的标准。换句话说，就是越多人能够去认同更好的事物，那这个就仍然是越值得我们去追求，或者说定义为道德标准的。那这个他来讨论的就是快乐与低级快乐的一个区分，或者说你也可以说人更高级的满足，我觉得用满足会比较好形容，就是人更高级的满足跟低级的满足的一个区分。
Now, those of you who have read Mill already, how, according to him, is it possible to draw that distinction? How can a utilitarian distinguish qualitatively higher pleasures from lesser ones, base ones, unworthy ones? Yes?
If you've tried both of them, and you'll prefer the higher one naturally, always.
That's great. That's right. What's your name?
John.
So, as John points out, Mill says, here's the test. Since we can't step outside actual desires, actual preferences that would violate utilitarian premises, the only test of whether a pleasure is higher or lower is whether someone who has experienced both would prefer it. And here, in chapter 2, we see the passage where Mill makes the point that John just described. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, in other words, no outside, no independent standard, then that is the more desirable pleasure. What do people think about that argument? Does it succeed? How many think that it does succeed? Of arguing within utilitarian terms for a distinction between higher and lower pleasures. How many think it doesn't succeed? Right, I want to hear your reasons. But before we give the reasons, let's do an experiment of Mill's claim. In order to do this experiment, we're going to look at 3 short excerpts of popular entertainment. The first one is a Hamlet soliloquy. It'll be followed by 2 other experiences. See what you think.
What a piece of work is a man. How noble in reason. How infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me.
Imagine a world where your greatest fears become reality.
They're flashing me!
Each show, 6 contestants from around the country battle each other in 3 extreme stunts.
Ow!
These stunts are designed to challenge the contestants both physically and mentally. 6 contestants, 3 stunts, 1 winner.
Yes! Woo!
Fear Factor.
Hi, diddly ho, pedal to the metalophiles.
Landers, since when do you like anything cool?
Well, I don't care for the speed, but I can't get enough of that safety gear. Helmets, roll bars, caution flags.
I like the fresh air and looking at the poor people in the infield.
Dang, Cletus, why'd you have to park by my parents?
Now, honey, it's my parents, too.
I don't even have to ask which one you like most. The Simpsons, how many like The Simpsons most? How many Shakespeare? What about Fear Factor? How many preferred Fear Factor? Really? People overwhelmingly like The Simpsons better than Shakespeare. All right, now let's take the other part of the poll. Which is the highest experience or pleasure? How many say Shakespeare? How many say Fear Factor? No, you can't be serious. Really? What? All right, go ahead, you can say.
I found that one the most entertaining.
I know, but which do you think was the worthiest, the noblest experience? I know you found it the most entertaining.
If something is good just because it is pleasurable, what does it matter whether you have sort of an abstract idea of whether it is good by someone else's sense or not?
All right, so you come down in the straight Benthamite side. Who's to judge? And why should we judge? Apart from just registering and aggregating de facto preferences. All right, that's fair enough. What's your name? Nate? Okay, fair enough. All right, so how many think The Simpsons is actually, apart from liking it, is actually the higher experience? Higher than Shakespeare. All right, let's see the vote for Shakespeare again. How many think Shakespeare is higher? All right, so why is it? Ideally, I'd like to hear from someone. Is there someone who thinks Shakespeare is highest, but who preferred watching The Simpsons? Yes?
Like, I guess just sitting watching The Simpsons, it's entertaining because they make jokes and they make us laugh, but like, someone has to tell us that Shakespeare was this great writer. We had to be taught how to read him, how to understand him. We had to be taught how to kind of take in Rembrandt, how to analyze a painting.
Well, what's your name?
Anisha.
Anisha, when you say someone told you that Shakespeare is better,
right,
are you accepting it on blind faith? You voted that Shakespeare is higher only because the culture tells you that, or teachers tell you that, or do you actually agree with that yourself?
Well, in the sense of Shakespeare, no, but earlier you made an example of Rembrandt. I feel like I would enjoy reading a comic book more than I would enjoy kind of analyzing Rembrandt because someone told me it was great, you know? Right, so some of this seems to be, you're suggesting a kind of cultural convention and pressure. We're told what books, what works of art are great. Who else? Yes.
Although I enjoyed watching The Simpsons more in this particular moment in Justice, if I were to spend the rest of my life considering the 3 different video clips shown, I would not want to spend that remainder of my life considering the latter 2 clips. I think I would derive more pleasure from being able to branch out in my own mind, sort of considering more deep pleasures, more deep thoughts.
And tell me your name.
Joe.
Joe. So, if you had to spend the rest of your life on a farm in Kansas with only Shakespeare or the collected episodes of The Simpsons, you would prefer Shakespeare? What do you conclude from that about John Stuart Mill's test? That the test of a higher pleasure is whether people who have experienced both prefer it.
Can I cite another example briefly?
Yeah.
In neurobiology last year, we were told of a rat who was tested a particular center in the brain where the rat was able to stimulate its brain and cause itself intense pleasure repeatedly. The rat did not eat or drink until it died. So the rat was clearly experiencing intense pleasure. Now, if you ask me right now if I would rather experience intense pleasure or have a full lifetime of higher pleasure, I would consider intense pleasure to be low pleasure. I would right now enjoy intense pleasure. But, yes, I would. I certainly would. But over a lifetime, I would think almost a complete majority here would agree that they would rather be a human with higher pleasure than be that rat with intense pleasure for a momentary period of time.
So,
now, in answer to your question,
right.
I think this proves that, or I won't say proves, I think the conclusion is that Mill's theory that when a majority of people are asked what they would rather do, they will answer that they would rather engage in a higher pleasure.
So you think that this supports Mill? You think Mill is onto something here?
I do.
All right. Is there anyone who disagrees with Joe and who thinks that our experiment disproves Mill's test, shows that that's not an adequate way, that you can't distinguish higher pleasures within the utilitarian framework? Yes.
If whatever is good is truly just whatever people prefer, it's truly relative and there's no objective definition, then there will be some society where people prefer Simpsons more. Anyone can appreciate The Simpsons, but I think it does take education to appreciate Shakespeare as much.
All right, you're saying it takes education to appreciate higher things. Mill's point is that the higher pleasures do require cultivation and appreciation and education. He doesn't dispute that. But once having been cultivated and educated, people will not only see the difference between higher and lower pleasures, but will actually prefer the higher to the lower. You find this famous passage from John Stuart Mill: "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their side of the question." So here you have an attempt to distinguish higher from lower pleasures. So going to an art museum or being a couch potato and swilling beer watching television at home. Sometimes, Mill agrees, we might succumb to the temptation to do the latter, to be couch potatoes. But even when we do that out of indolence and sloth, we know that the pleasure we get gazing at Rembrandts in the museum is actually higher, because we've experienced both. And it is a higher pleasure gazing at Rembrandts because it engages our higher human faculties. What about Mill's attempt to reply to the objection about individual rights? In a way, he uses the same kind of argument. And this comes out in chapter 5. He says, I dispute the pretensions of any theory which sets up an imaginary standard of justice not grounded on utility, but still he considers justice grounded on utility to be what he calls the chief part and incomparably the most sacred and binding part of all morality. So justice is higher. Individual rights are privileged, but not for reasons that depart from utilitarian assumptions. Justice is a name for certain moral requirements which, regarded collectively, stand higher in the scale of social utility and are therefore of more paramount obligation than any others. So justice is sacred, it's prior, it's privileged, it isn't something that can easily be traded off against lesser things. But the reason is ultimately, Mill claims, a utilitarian reason once you consider the long-run interests of humankind, of all of us as progressive beings. If we do justice and if we respect rights, society as a whole will be better off in the long run. Well, is that convincing? Or is Mill actually, without admitting it, stepping outside utilitarian considerations in arguing for qualitatively higher pleasures and for sacred or specially important individual rights? We haven't fully answered that question, because to answer that question in the case of rights and justice will require that we explore other ways, non-utilitarian ways of accounting for the basis of rights, and then asking whether they succeed. As for Jeremy Bentham, who launched utilitarianism as a doctrine in moral and legal philosophy, Bentham died in 1832 at the age of 85. But if you go to London, you can visit him today, literally. He provided in his will that his body be preserved, embalmed, and displayed in the University of London, where he still presides in a glass case with a wax head, dressed in his actual clothing. You see, before he died, Bentham addressed himself to a question consistent with his philosophy. Of what use could a dead man be to the living? One use, he said, would be to make one's corpse available to the study of anatomy. In the case of great philosophers, however, better yet, to preserve one's physical presence in order to inspire future generations of thinkers. You want to see what Bentham looks like? Stuffed? Here's what he looks like. There he is. Now, if you look closely, you will notice that the embalming of his actual head was not a success. So they substituted a waxed head, and at the bottom, for verisimilitude, you can actually see his actual head on a plate. You see it? Right there. So, what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story, by the way, they bring him out during meetings of the board at University College London, and the minutes record him as present but not voting. Here is a philosopher in life and in death who adhered to the principles of his philosophy. We'll continue with rights next time.
功利主义其实就是一个大我跟小我的概念，但是照功利主义的道德律来讲的话，多数人就决定是大我。那么当大我多数人做共同选择的时候呢，小我的道德就不存在，或者是说就没有意义。这就好像我们看到船难事件，如果按照功利主义来讲的话呢，那么3个人为了生存而去杀害船上唯一生病的青年人，做了这个尸体的分食，以求得3个人的活命。那么在功利主义来讲的话，这个是没有错的，因为这是符合了大我所谓的幸福感，或者是说生存的满足。但是引起的诟病就变成是说人数的多寡不能够去反映世间所有的事情，这也是帮我们第1集看到的。人性里头当中，对于无辜者会有一种先天的理解以及同理的怜悯，所以呢，它并没有办法满足人们本身出于私利的堕落的一种道德自我批判，所以这个大我跟小我呢，它就变成很肤浅。但是从密友出现之后呢，密友就认为说，这个大我小我的理论框架仍然是没有错的，但是你有开始进入到追求一种所谓绝对道德，所以这也是为什么刚桑德尔教授才提到说，难道密友这种改良版的功利主义就真的 只是功利主义，还是它已经超越了功利主义，不再是功利主义呢？这就是以后我们的课程要来谈到的是绝对道德的一个价值观，也就是人性当中它有更崇高或是更美善的一个价值，但是人性当中也有堕落，也有罪恶的地方。那么没有相信说，如果人们都经历过去比较的话，他认为多数的决定就是人们会更容易倾向去选择更好的，也就是人性中更光辉的一面，而不是更糟更阴暗一面。但是这个就像刚刚我们在影片中看到，就是说，可是这个需不需要被教育呢？对吧？好，你要怎么让人们去了解有更好的事物的追求呢？那如果没有一定的指引跟教育的话，人有没有可能自动自发的去产生这种追求更高层次的满足感呢？举例来讲，就好像说，你给一个刚牙牙学语的孩子看绘本，那文字很简单，是当一个人他在语言文字上面学习的更丰富，对语言理解的更多的时候，那么绘本肯定不能满足他了，对吧？他可能就需要到看小说了，他会发现到那个精神上追求的满足感是更高。可是这个是需要经过学习的，同样有经历过别人为他牺牲奉献的时候，他可能会被人性更高的光辉所感染，那么他就有可能更容易的去做到为他人牺牲奉献，因为大家互相都彼此经历过，大家更趋向于选择活在一个更为他人牺牲奉献的世界观里，不然的话，人就只能流于动物性低层次的弱肉强食、尔虞我诈的一个状态当中，因为没有人经历过所谓的为他人牺牲奉献对人自身的一种满足。这就好像为什么我们讲说，在家庭里头，你被父母爱过的孩子，充分感受到父母给予爱的孩子，这样的孩子他就比较有能力去爱别人，因为他经历过，他就有办法学习到为什么这个爱别人看似是消耗自己的时间跟精神，可是这却是更值得的一种满足，这个就是属于一种学习。所以我个人认为呢，没有它是属于把功利主义的架构，其实很大层次上已经舍弃掉，只剩下对群体性仍然存有一种正面的看法，就是他相信群体只要都经历过，人性至终会选择更好的一个价值，或者说更好的一种精神满足。但是这个是不是就一定是这么单纯的如此呢？还有另外一个大哉问的难题，就是说谁来决定群体的一个学习？我举例来讲，就在一个原始的部落社会，好比说可能杀人献祭是他们部落的文化，他们认为这个没有什么不妥，因为这个是他们过去部落的习俗一直流传的祭祀的文明或活动的话，那么你要怎么样让这个整体的部落来理解说，其实杀人献祭是不道德的？好，那你要怎么样去让群体能够重新的一种方式去经历或做学习，而选择舍弃掉野蛮的仪式或者说习俗？那这个就变成是一个大哉问，因为谁能够来指导他们做这样的学习？在寻求绝对道德的时候，其实没有仍然会出现一个很大的难题，就是人们终究不可能永远都去在事物之间都去同时经历，然后再做出比较，不可能所有的事情人们都是经过了比较之后才能够得到最好的结论。这就好像回到传难事件也是一样，如果说船上的3个人宁可自己饿死，也不愿意去杀害那一个已经生病的年轻人的话，那么是不是也要这3个人他都有经历过说，我可能曾经面临到一个生存的威胁，因为别人想要杀害我，以求得他自身的生存。那我面临过这个威胁，所以我知道己所不欲，勿施于人。我知道为了自己的生存而去杀害别人是不道德的。因为我经历过，那是不是要同时那船上的3个人都经历过，才有可能形成一种集体的选择，是趋向于说我们不应该去杀害这个人，对吧？所以没有的难题其实是在于是人类的文明或者说进步有没有办法能够等待这么久的时间，每样事情都有办法从经历过后才能够去得出结论嘛？那这个也就是回到一个更根本问题，有没有可能我们一开始就能够找到绝对道德的标准的时候，我们可以在没有经历之前，我们就可以能够有一个信任呢？这个有趣吧？我们就留到后面的课程再来探讨。但至少今天我们已经看到了功利主义的发展，与其说是改良，不如说它其实已经舍弃掉很多功利主义的错误问题了。因为没有来讲，事物的性质是有定性，有所谓的光辉或堕落之分的，或者说是更高跟比较低层次的精神满足。那确实没有，它已经是承认事物的角度是有定性之分。OK。无论如何，欢迎你在下方留言告诉我你期不期待看到第5集。我非常衷心的希望呢，这一堂课是越来越多人愿意跟我们一起来参与思索思辨灵性与智性的一场旅程。我们这边是超级神队友，我们就下部影片再见，拜拜。
This we know, the cornerstone is Christ alone, our hope now forever.